Yes, you get some amazing and wonderfully crafted action sequences on Arrakis itself between the Fremen and the Harkonnens, the forces and the Emperor, and of course, yes, the sandworms, though I missed hearing the rock music of Toto while Paul Muad'Dib was riding on the back of a sandworm. I imagine by this point you guys have watched and listened to a number of reviews for Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2, or might have already seen it for yourselves at this point. I'm not a part of any particular critics association, so I wasn't able to see the film early, nearly 2 weeks ago, like so many others. Those critics in their fancy, schmancy, opulent screenings, in all honesty, those critic screenings when I used to go to them back in the day, aren't all that special. And sometimes they can be even worse, especially if you just have some obnoxious critics just clapping like seals to let you know they recognize something on screen just to show off the fact that they're so much smarter than everyone else sitting around them. So I went to a regular screening with all the schmucks and schlubs of this world because I, too, am a schmuck and a schlub. And I have a lot to say about this movie, about the sequel. A film that many people have been so excited to see for years. But before talking about Dune Part 2, I did want to briefly talk about my own experiences with Dune and its other adaptations that I've seen. I remember reading Frank Herbert's 1965 novel years ago, probably right before I was about to graduate high school and enter college. And while I respected the magnificent world building, which of course inspired so many creators and film franchises like Star Wars, I found the material to be incredibly dense, pretty dense, and couldn't really invest myself in the story and characters all that much. I later watched the 1984 David Lynch film, and that was interesting. I guess I don't hate that movie though, and there's certainly some fun to be had with it, but it's enormously flawed, and trying to tell that story in one film just seemed like a fool's errand. And though I have been aware of it for some time, I never watched the TV miniseries from the early 2000s, although I heard kind of mixed things about that too. I have seen Dune Part 1 and actually rewatched it again recently just to kind of like reacquaint myself with the material. And while I like the movie and think its special effects, production design, and action sequences are superb, I did find the film to be lacking. Lacking when it came to, most of the characters. Aside from Jason Momoa's Duncan Idaho, Aquabro, I really liked him.
You're welcome, man.
And I don't know, just so much of the narrative just kind of ended up being, like, set up. With like no real payoff of any kind. Plus a pretty awkward ending as well. I mean, the movie just kind of literally stops. However, I was growing increasingly interested in the sequel with so much early praise coming from critics and audiences who saw it early, nearly 2 weeks ago. But to give you a sense of the film's, story before diving into the review itself, reeling from the betrayal and destruction of his family, Paul Atreides unites with the Fremen of Arrakis to challenge the might of the Harkonnens and the Emperor of the known universe, all the while dealing with visions of a horrific future only he can foresee. I'm going to get this out of the way very early on. Is Dune Part 2 better than the first film? The answer is fuck yeah, it is. I'm very happy to say that. I'm very happy to say that it most certainly is to a significant degree. Mostly because this film is just one of the most gorgeous examples of pure visual spectacle that I've seen in quite some time. Denis Villeneuve and his collaborators have brought Frank Herbert's world of Dune to just glorious life in this movie, in the sequel, in such a way that it most assuredly will inspire other creators and filmmakers with its visual grandeur for years, if not decades to come. It's the look of the movie that most impresses me. It's very obvious that, so much thought was put into the way this world, this universe just functions. From the beautiful desert sands of Arrakis to the terrifying monochromatic hellscape that is the Harkonnen homeworld of Gedi Prime, there is a constant sense of lavish history to the various aesthetics on full display throughout the entire movie. Matter of fact, like one of my favorite moments of the movie is actually set on Gedi Prime, the seat of power of the Harkonnen. I've always called them Harkonnen, by the way, but they call them Harkonnen in the movie, so fair enough. We're gonna call them Harkonnen. But it's the seat of power of House Harkonnen, the planet which has been ravaged by industrialization. Orbits like a black sun, and it makes everything monochromatic. Like everything appears in black and white, basically. We're watching this savage gladiatorial like battle between combatants. And we're also introduced to like a certain villain I want to highlight in just a bit. But the look of the scene and the fight choreography is just absolutely spectacular during this sequence. It's beautiful and how terrifying it is. They even have these like fireworks like going off above the arena, but instead of them being like, multicolored, like fireworks often are, they actually reminded me of these like huge ink blots, like exploding like ink blocks and blotches, across the entire sky. I thought that was like really cool and just something unique and, something I hadn't really seen before. Nothing that immediately comes to mind, honestly. Of course, that's just one visually stunning sequence, in the movie. There are so many others that are incredible as well. And yes, you get some amazing and wonderfully crafted action sequences on Arrakis itself between the Fremen and the Harkonnens, the forces of the Emperor, and of course, yes, the sandworms. Though I missed hearing the rock music of Toto while Paul Muad'Dib was riding on the back of a sandworm. All the sequence involving the worms, though, are pretty damn good and awe-inspiring, but I could use a little Toto. Because of all this action and these sequences, the film's pacing is significantly better than the first. And while it does occasionally slow down at points, I never felt bored while watching this movie at all. In terms of the characters, there are some notable standouts in the cast to me. Javier Bardem plays Stilgar, who's like a Fremen leader who was originally introduced in the first film, though he had very little to do except spit everywhere.
Stilgar, welcome.
Hold. Thank you, Stilgar, for the gift of your body's moisture.
Here, he has an increased role. He's still spitting, so don't worry about that, and provides some of the most comedic moments, honestly, in the movie. Despite becoming increasingly zealous in his belief of Paul being this messianic figure, I ended up like really enjoying his character and really liking his character, and it was great to have just a character just provide some levity in this movie, which is very serious, very self-serious, of course. Josh Brolin also returns as Gurney, who survived the events of the first film and reunites with Paul. Well, not as funny as Stilgar. His personality is a welcome one, and he gets several scenes that make him stand out compared to the rest of the cast. The last person I really want to highlight is a character played by Austin Butler, the younger nephew of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, Fade Rotha Harkonnen. We're first introduced to him during that monochromatic gladiatorial sequence on Gedi Prime that I mentioned earlier, and he's easily my favorite character in the movie because he is a psychopathic monster, and other characters even describe him that way throughout the movie. This is the polar opposite of his performance as Elvis from a couple of years ago. And I personally think that's great. Fade is cruel, savage, intelligent, and relentless in this movie. You don't know what he's going to do from one moment to the next, but it will most likely involve murder or torture of some kind. He's just so purely evil. And you can tell Butler is relishing playing such a despicable character. And honestly, I wish he was in the movie more than he is. Because he was just so good, and it was, I think, a huge improvement over the villains from part one, from the previous film. So Dune Part 2 has a lot going for it, and features just some of the best production design in a science fiction film in quite some time. It has some stunning and just awe-inspiring action sequences, and a few performances that really stood out in my mind. But
Nothing someone says before the word but really counts.
But
this movie is not perfect, nor is it a masterpiece in my eyes, due to the fact that it has some outstanding flaws. While definitely better than Dune Part 1, thankfully, because it has more going on in just sheer visual splendor, I do have some issues, with this film. And it comes down to the story, the dialogue, and the characters, especially the characters. And I'm sure some people are not going to be happy hearing that, but I think Villeneuve himself has clearly indicated he is not interested in dialogue and characters. And in Dune Part 2, I think, serves as that example. While I highlighted members of the cast like Bardem and Butler, who I feel elevated the material with their performances, whether it was with humor or psychotic glee, the rest of the characters don't have that much depth or really charismatic or interesting exchanges. There's so many examples across the film, but I noticed it especially with Paul and Chani's romance and the supposed villainous threat of the Harkonnens. One of the things I was most looking forward to was the relationship between Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya's characters of Paul and Chani. Paul felt so distant and flat in the previous film, and Chani was mostly just seen in visions and only really truly appeared and had interactions with just a few characters at the very end of the first film, so we didn't really get a sense of her. So you did all that buildup, I suppose. Let's go ahead and see that complicated, passionate romance between these people. I don't think that's a hard ask. And after seeing the movie, I'm still waiting for it at this point. There was such a lack of chemistry, romantic chemistry, between the two of them in this film, mostly because the dialogue they're given doesn't really stand out. There's just simply no energy to their romance, which I feel like is necessary to a romance. You need to have that energy. You got to put a little pep in that step, and these two just don't have enough pep. I mean, the one thing that I really liked about, Zendaya's Chani is that they made her, and also a friend of hers, skeptical of the messianic prophecy surrounding Paul Muad'Dib. She pushes back against it, which was changed from the book, I believe. And honestly, I think it was a smart choice and made her stand out, certainly more than Paul himself. Chalamet as Paul, again, he has more to do here than in part one, but he's still doing that whisper speak shit. And it's like, fear is the mind killer. Mumble. He just mumbling to himself half the time. But he does scream more often. And it jolts you out of your seat when he does. It's like, ah! He makes some speeches in the movie too, though I wouldn't describe them as particularly charismatic or inspiring, to be honest. Though they kind of imply in the movie that some of the Fremen aren't exactly that bright and can be easily swayed. We do get introduced to like different types of Fremen in this movie, and our main group of Fremen are like, oh yeah, those Fremen, idiots, bunch of dum-dums, those Fremen. I'm like, okay. So you can understand maybe why they, quickly fell under Paul's sway. You have some new characters introduced in the movie as well, like Florence Pugh as Princess Arulin and Christopher Walken as Emperor Shaddam IV. And as much as I enjoy Christopher Walken saying science fiction mumbo jumbo, and boy do I, very, very funny, they honestly don't get a lot to do and have little screen time. I suppose they'll have a larger role in the third film when that comes around. But, I hope, they're not underutilized like they are in part 2 when we do eventually get to that inevitable third film. Now, outside of Austin Butler as Fade, who is charismatic and very fun to watch, the villains, House Harkonnen, they just fucking suck. From Dave Bautista to Stellan Skarsgård, all they do is bark orders and yell at each other or anyone else in earshot. They are just so dull and one-dimensional. I mean, to be positive, they look really cool. I'll give them that. I mean, I love the designs for the characters. I love the look of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. It's a big, floaty, fat guy. It's hilarious. It's creepy. It's intimidating. But the thing is, like, Bautista and Skarsgård are amazing actors. And the material they're given and the dialogue they're given is just bad. They get the worst of it. And they're really flat. And we've seen them act in numerous projects and have done a great job. Now they're science fiction movies as well. Like even briefly, like in Blade Runner 2049, which was another Denis Villeneuve film that Bautista was in. Like his moment that he had with Ryan Gosling, I thought was fantastic in that movie. And, Stellan Skarsgård recently coming off of Andor, that Star Wars spinoff show from Rogue One, he gets some of the best dialogue in that show. He delivers one of my favorite just monologues in science fiction in quite some time. One of my favorite pieces of dialogue in Star Wars history. And I'm like, why can't we just do that in this movie? Well, I mean, what's the excuse? I mean, come on. I mean, they need to be charismatic villains. I should fear them instead of going like, oh, we're with these guys again. The incompetence. And that's the thing. And there's even opportunities to give them more depth, and seemingly things are like set up to do that. Like in this movie, like in the movie, like we learn about an interesting connection between Paul and the Baron. Something that I thought was going to play a role in the story. But they do nothing with it. My whole thing is, like, why even bring that thing up then? It's brought up like a little fun fact, and one's like, that's cool. Anyway, sandworms. I'm like, that's just really frustrating to me. If you're not going to do anything with it, then just don't even bother including it at that point. Because I think you could have, again, I want to say exactly what it is, but it's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what they're going to do with it. And they do nothing with it. And the reason why I feel like my criticisms of the story, dialogue, and characters are so valid is pretty much based on the fact that Villeneuve himself has admitted he cares more about visuals and less about a film's story and dialogue between characters. And again, thank you to GC in my Twitch chat for bringing this to my attention the other day. But in an interview with the Times of London, he had this to say, and these are his words. Frankly, I hate dialogue. Dialogue is for theater and television. I don't remember movies because of a good line. I remember movies because of a strong image. I'm not interested in dialogue at all. Pure image and sound. That is the power of cinema. But it's something not obvious when you watch movies today. Movies have been corrupted by television. He also went on to say this. In a perfect world, I'd make a compelling movie that doesn't feel like an experiment, but does not have a single word in it either. People would leave the cinema and say, wait, there was no dialogue, but they won't feel the lack. Well, to be perfectly honest, I felt the lack in this movie. And while I sincerely disagree with his opinions on dialogue and find his statements on television incredibly insulting, honestly, to the many people that create amazing content in that medium, what would have made this movie better? What would have made me love it instead of really liking it? What would have made me say it was excellent instead of saying it was good? Sometimes great, but it's good. Is if more effort was put into the characters and the dialogue. If an equal amount of effort that was put into the visuals was put into most of the characters, at least the primary cast, I would probably be saying right now, this is the masterpiece that so many others are saying it is. But I do think it's a good movie. Certainly better than Dune Part 1, no question. And filmed to the brim with breathtaking visuals, incredible action sequences, and just some of the best production design of the decade so far, especially in terms of science fiction. And again, it's all set in an interesting world that sadly, it's just held back by a number of flat characters and uninteresting, but I suppose serviceable dialogue at best. Like, it's serviceable. But again, that's just how I feel about this movie. A movie I can walk away and say, like, this was very good. I liked it, but I'm not in love with it. I still feel like there's something missing. I still feel like something could have been improved. But I can also understand why people like this, But what about you guys? Did you guys feel like I did? Did you love absolutely every minute of it, or did you, like, a polar opposite? Did you hate the film? Should I be just sucked into a hungry maw of a sandworm for defying Muad'Dib? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.
He who controls the spice controls the universe.